I'm Kate Rothko, Prizel, and I am here for the opening of this wonderful exhibition of my father's works here at the National Gallery in Warsaw. I think you will find the exhibit extremely exciting. For me, it is a very exciting moment to see my father's work here in Warsaw, where it's never been shown. In fact, my father's work has rarely been shown east of Paris, so this is really a wonderful new venue for his work, and I hope he will meet a new audience who will really come to have a conversation with his paintings. This first room in the exhibit really gives you, the audience, a unique opportunity to see some of the influences on my father's life and on his work. Influences from literature, from music, and from painters of the past. This is not an approach which has commonly been taken at exhibits of my father's work, and it is a unique curatorial contribution, really, which I think you here in Warsaw have the opportunity to appreciate. Here the curator has put together a selection of some of the works of literature and philosophy which were important to my father. And what I most vividly remember is his constantly reading Shakespeare. So we have a volume or two from his Shakespeare collection. And I find it interesting, and this is also true of his musical taste, that we see a very conservative and classical selection of works, if you will. Even in the choice of the American literature that he read, it was certainly nothing very avant-garde. The book I remember among American works that he read was Look Homeward, Angel by Thomas Wolfe. One thinks of my father as a modern painter who wanted to break away from the past. And again, when we see something of his musical collection, it perhaps is striking to see that, again, his main interest was in classical music. What I remember always playing in his studio was Mozart, and he was particularly fond of Mozart opera, so a number of those albums have been included here. He certainly knew modern American composers. He was friendly with John Cage and with Morton Feldman, and I'm sure had heard his music. But yet the most avant-garde thing, if you will, that he put on his record player in the studio was Beethoven. So again, an interesting connection with the past for a very modern painter. Of course, it's very difficult to choose a single work of art by another artist to place in the gallery as representative of an influence on his painting. But it's interesting, again, that the selection here is of an etching by Rembrandt. And I do indeed remember that Rembrandt was one of my father's favorite painters. Often when he, I have to say, dragged me to the Metropolitan Museum in New York as a 8-year-old, I remember going to the gallery of Rembrandt. And perhaps my father was particularly intrigued with Rembrandt's use of light. And there is one apocryphal story which has been told about my father, trying to combine the names Rothko and Rembrandt, trying to equate himself to Rembrandt. So clearly this was something, he saw Rembrandt as a genius, and he hoped that somehow he could achieve something similar in his art. This room represents a very interesting collection of various periods of my father's early work. My father took a long time, perhaps a period of almost 30 years, to arrive at his mature style of painting and reach his mature voice, if you will, as an artist. And in this room, you can see his several of his earlier styles of the 1930s and early to mid-1940s. And I thought I'd introduce you to a couple of paintings in more detail. These two paintings on this wall are from the early 1940s, and this is a period when not only my father, but many artists of his generation were strongly influenced by myth. And my father also wrote a great deal about the influence in his life and in his art of Greek art and Greek mythology. And these particular two works, I think, are very reminiscent of the impact of Greek mythology on his painting. They are some of his earliest works, which are said to be from the Surrealist period. Two later works are seen further down in the gallery, and you can see quite an evolution in his style. But these earliest works, I really see a connection to Greek mythology. Just as this room does not lay out the paintings in strictly chronological order, as I guide you through exhibit, am also not following a strict chronology. So actually, this painting was painted a couple of years before the two paintings I discussed previously. This is a painting from my father's somewhat later realist period, if you will call it that. Clearly, these are not strictly representational paintings. Even the figures in this painting have a very ghost-like quality, if you will. This is a painting painted around 1940. My father did a series of paintings where he painted the interior of the New York subway. And I feel a particular connection with this group of paintings because I think of my father as a quintessential New Yorker and the New York subway as a quintessential representation of New York City, or a quintessential symbol of New York City. My father, of course, was born in Europe, and as many immigrants to the United States, he often looked back toward Europe. And in fact, he spent his early years in the Western United States. But I think it wasn't until he came to the East Coast and settled in New York City that he really felt at home. And I think New York has that unique quality of letting you be inside America, but at the same time be looking toward home across the Atlantic in Europe. And that's why I think my father felt particularly comfortable in New York City and really made that his permanent home. So to me, when I look at these paintings painted in the New York subway, I think of his comfort in New York City. These paintings are also interesting because they are divided formally in a way which I think gives us some premonition of his later work. The paintings are divided into these kind of rectangles of color in the background. And as we will see, this is a motif which is seen throughout his mature painting. So it's often interesting to look at the earlier paintings from a formalistic standpoint and see if we can see elements which he then used later on in his painting career. In this room, we can see the very rapid transformation that my father's work underwent during the last 3 to 4 years of the 1940s. So while through the 20s and 30s, the changes in his style may have been relatively gradual, in this compressed period of only 3 years, the paintings went from these rather complex paintings with multiple forms, often called multiforms for lack of a better term, to a painting which at the end of the room, which is almost a transitional piece approaching his mature style. So the rapid evolution of his work is really evident just and simply encompassed by these 4 paintings. This particular painting is fascinating because it was painted early in 1949, and we will see a painting later from that same year. But that was the year of perhaps the most rapid changes in my father's work. It was actually a year in which he was extremely prolific, and he moved from a painting like this, which I suppose one might still categorize as a multiform painting, to a painting which is to a style of painting which emerged by 1950, where he had simplified his canvas down to 2 or 3 rectangular forms. And this painting is particularly interesting because one already begins to see this rectangularization, if you will, within the canvas. It's also interesting because of his use of light and color up in the right-hand corner. Very interesting play of the pink against the almost white form on the other side of this rectangle. So this is perhaps what we might call the very beginning of his transition to his mature style. Here we see a painting painted considerably later in the year 1949, which I think you can see further simplification of the forms and the beginning of this horizontal orientation, which became so typical in my father's later work. It's interesting because my father wrote actually a great deal about his painting long before he reached this mature period. In fact, he wrote a whole treatise on his philosophy of painting in the very early 1940s, which presaged a lot of elements of his later work. And one thing which is particularly interesting to me is that he talked of the importance of tragedy in his painting. And often people react to these lighter, more pastel paintings involving a lot of pinks and reds, which were typical of this year 1949 and certainly of his works in the early 50s, as being particularly optimistic. And that was certainly my reaction to these works growing up with them as a child. But it is interesting to step back as an adult for me and to read some of his philosophy of painting and realize that even with some of these lighter paintings, he was trying to project a tragic image. And it's something which I think it is hard for the viewer to come to grips with, but is very interesting to know that he was writing about. Again, we are in a very interesting room in this exhibition. Often curators agonize before they hang a show about how works of art are going to work together and play off each other. And I think this room is a particularly interesting example of that, because again, we are not presented a simply chronologic image of my father's work. Here we have a painting such as we just discussed, which would really have to be classified as a transitional work, opposite a painting painted more than a decade later. So it is a fascinating juxtaposition, and it's very interesting to stand here and see how well the three paintings work with each other, despite the fact that they are drawn from quite different periods of my father's work. Also, interestingly, in this room, we do not have perhaps a classic painting from the 1950s, what one typically associates with Mark Rothko and everyone runs to see as a bright red and pink painting painted in the early 50s. And that is not what the curator has chosen here. He's chosen some fascinating work from the earlier 1950s. This is a particular favorite of mine, which I have has been shown in other exhibitions, and I've also had the privilege of seeing it several times when it wasn't hanging but was in storage at the National Gallery in Washington, and is a particular favorite. But not a classic work of the 1950s. Instead, we jump to a work from the early 1960s. And I find this a very interesting curatorial selection, which works very well together. I think I choose to say a little bit more about this painting, perhaps because the paintings of the 1960s are the ones which I feel the most at home with, because I grew up with them, and I grew up with them when I was a little bit more mature, when I was a teenager, and perhaps could have a somewhat deeper understanding of my father's work. I will, however, say that for me, it is always a little difficult to look at the darker palette of his paintings of the 1960s without some way associating it with a more pessimistic view, perhaps a more depressive aspect of my father's life. And it's very hard for me to step back and distance myself from him as a person and from what was going on in his life at the time. But really, it is now over 40 years since my father died, and I think as I have spent more time with these dark works and been able to get a little emotional distance from the works, I can really see them from a totally different perspective. And I don't really see any less optimism in these works than in the works of the 1950s. Certainly, I think he felt he was continuing, perhaps in a different vein, to project his opinions and the importance of tragedy. But I don't think he was trying to make us see any sort of personal tragedy. And in fact, as works we will see later in the exhibition, I think this was simply for him finding a different mode of expression, a new voice in which to get a philosophical message across. For me, this room is a wonderful culmination of the exhibit, perhaps because it is so reminiscent for me of the Rothko chapel in which my father painted for an ecumenical chapel in Houston, Texas. This was such an important point in my father's career. Certainly not the end of his career, but a culmination in the sense that it allowed him to reach the ultimate in terms of his ability to communicate emotionally and spiritually with his audience. And in that sense, I think for him, it was the true pinnacle of his career. And therefore, for the show to close on this note, I think is incredibly moving and appropriate. I really want the visitors to this particular gallery to take advantage of how this space is laid out. One of the things that is a great advantage when you only have two paintings in a room is that you can really have time to sit on a bench, as I am, and truly contemplate a work of art. And I think that was something which was particularly important to my father. He knew it was not necessarily an easy process for the viewer to have a conversation, if you will, with his work. And it often took time. And one of the things that is possible in this gallery is to sit opposite either of these two paintings and really spend the time communing with the work. And that is particularly important with these very dark works, where that communication isn't always such an easy process.